silencing. On an individual level, the cries of the colonized went unheard as they slaved away in factories, in fields, in the homes of the colonizers. And on a global macro level, whole countries are stripped of resources and go unheard in the new economic world order that we have today. Colonization is something that can never be walked back. But on our side, we are proud to defend a mechanism by which power is slowly given back to those who need it the most to those that had it taken away from them. I'm going to do 3 things in today's speech. I'm going to first set up what we plan to defend on our side and tell you what the comparative opposition has to defend is. Then I'm going to tell you why on a principled level this is the only just cause of action, and last of all explain to you the practical benefits that arise from this. First of all, what exactly is the status quo that we're talking about? We're talking about how countries form trade agreements with each other. Right now, countries form trade agreements based on a number of factors. They could form it based on proximity. That's why we have trading blocs like ASEAN, EU, and NAFTA. They could form it based on political stances. For example, the EU makes it basically as a policy of not trading with dictatorships. And they could form it based on economic benefit to themselves, which is how a lot of trade agreements are formed. You form them based on a beneficial economic transfer. The kinds of countries we're talking about are countries where colonization occurred in the form of economic and political domination. I'm sure everyone knows this, but basically we're talking about the UK in the Commonwealth, France in Africa, the Dutch East Indies, like that. I don't think there'll be any clarifications. What is our policy? We're going to have a system of aggressive trading, 3 or 4 tiers. First of all, we're going to lift tariffs on goods. We're going to remove the kind of protectionist policies that countries have to protect their own agricultural and textile industries. We're going to have privileged bilateral trade agreements between former colonies and former colonial masters. And we're going to let these agreements be initiated based on the interest of former colonized countries. So, for instance, if Singapore doesn't want to launch a new trade deal with Britain, they don't have to. Britain cannot pressure them in any form to do so. All of this must be started by the colonized countries themselves. Second of all, we're going to reduce the barriers to trade. In this case, we're going to, where trade deals already exist, we're going to rewrite those trade deals in order to be more beneficial. Third of all, we want exploited powers to take charge of negotiations. Fourth of all, existing regulations surrounding trade deals are still going to apply. So, for example, if you have existing labor environmental regulations as a condition for certain trade deals, you're going to keep to those. Last of all, here are the checks that are going to occur within the kinds of colonial ex-colonized countries themselves. I think in most ex-colonized countries, there already exists a lot of wariness of former colonial masters, as well as a lot of inherent anti-imperialist sentiment because of what happened to them in the past. Arthur should know he wrote the influence life on this based on the history of oppression of China. I think that all of this means that these kinds of policies are going to be scrutinized quite heavily by governments when they initiate these trade deals. So in all of these there are already existing internal checks and balances, clarification, and end of policy.
Yeah.
Here is what opposition then has to defend. Opposition defends existing trade deals, or they defend trade deals struck with other kinds of countries. I think the most likely alternative they will have to defend is these countries trading in existing regional blocs or trading with the hot new player on the scene, China. Yes, Adil?
So Britain would therefore provide preferential tariffs to countries in Malaysia, but not Vietnam or Indonesia. Am I right?
Sure, because we're going to do this about former direct relations between colonial powers and former colonized masters. Of course, there are going to be instances where your sphere of oppression has spread further than the country you were directly targeting. But because we're talking about direct targeting, I think this is the most direct form of reparations we can take. Okay, so principle of reparations, I think this is pretty straightforward. Look, colonization massively privileged a handful of countries at the expense of everyone else. Formerly colonized countries were stripped of natural resources, for example, oil, palm, sugar, diamonds. And this was stolen in the form, labor was stolen in the form of slavery in America, in the form of black individuals shipped to Europe. Citizens of former colonized countries were denied education, denied wages, denied humane living conditions, and they were forced to work in harmful conditions that benefited former colonial masters at the expense of developing their own industries and had long-term harmful impacts on their health, which prevented them from later providing for their family. And more insidiously, there was a destruction of existing industries and markets that already existed within these countries that then prevented the economic development of the country and kept them subservient in the global economic order that we see today. Why then do the former colonies owe a duty? Simply because of an extension of personal injury principles, right? Like if you directly harm somebody in real life, you pay a reparation to them, and that's a legal principle that we build into every single interaction that we have with every other. If you as a country struck a huge and devastating blow, not just to a single individual, but to an entire country that then prevented them from moving forward, you too owe reparations to them. I think if opposition wants to come up and say they would prefer something like a cash transfer, I'm just going to tell you that reparations in the form of a one-off cash transfer just seem less likely than what's going to happen to our side, because at least on our side we have some kind of mutual benefits. Obviously, we're happy to do this as well if they really want, but I also think economic trade is more sustainable than a one-off cash transfer, because economic trade is something that goes on over time. What are the practical benefits that we're talking about in this case? First of all, you remove barriers to trade. This allows ex-colonies to gain economic advantages and develop faster than they would otherwise. Two tiers for this. First of all, lots of countries currently in the West have protectionist policies that allow them to protect things like their agricultural industry or their textile industry. For example, the EU has pretty heavy protectionist policies that are pretty bad. Why is this harmful for countries that were formerly colonized? First of all, because it cuts off a large, wealthy and viable market for them, because that becomes exponentially more expensive for them to send their goods overseas when those domestic industries are already protected. By removing these trade policies, we allow them to gain access to this market where, first of all, there is a large number of consumers, and second of all, consumers are more wealthy than in their home country or in the countries in the region, which allows them to gain greater profits because they are now able to access a larger subset of markets. Second of all, this also prevents things like dumping, which causes markets to never develop in those former colonized countries. So for example, the US and the EU dump huge amounts of agricultural and textile products in countries in Africa under the nominal guise of aid, because they have an overflow product based on their subsidies. We prevent this from happening, and because we prevent this from happening, we allow the independent development of markets to actually arise within those countries itself. So we get more trade and we prevent dumping, which kills markets. Right. Second of all, why is China a worse actor? It's an alternative, it's worse in terms of economic development because it doesn't sign things like responsible debtor agreements, and it purposely pushes countries into debt with their trade so that they are then able to seize political advantages and in many cases even seize the land of the country. I think China is actually the example of the new kind of colonial master that we are trying to check against, because the countries we're talking about tend to be A, more heavily scrutinized by constituents, and B, more bound by international agreements, and so are less likely to do this. I think Sharmila probably talked about this more. Very, very proud to propose.
Okay, thank you, Prime Minister, for a speech. Now, open the case opposition invited the organization.
Concede that colonial masters have done something terrible to colonies in the past. We realize that colonies have finally gotten freedom from the influence, the stifling, silencing influence of these colonial masters. We therefore don't want you to leave these developing countries imprisoned in a relationship of privilege. What is our counter policy? 4 things. Firstly, we endorse free trade. Secondly, like they say, we value things like proximity agreements, i.e. regional trade agreements that happen within developed countries, between countries that developing countries, between countries that used to be colonies. Thirdly, we don't want any aggressive favouring from colonial masters. These powers, right, will instead look at whether they have economic or political interest in making trade deals or partnerships with different countries. Fourthly, we think that colonizers should also commit to fair trade governed by things like WTO regulations and international norms. Before I go to my case proper, a few rebuttals. So Enting spends a long time telling you how bad colonialism is and how it's silencing. What she didn't tell you is why it is silencing. It is silencing and bad for 2 reasons. Number 1, because you are controlling other countries, so they have no freedom, no autonomy. Secondly, you control them in an exploitative way, i.e. you exploit these countries so that even if they develop in the process, they will develop always one step, not thank you, behind the colonial masters. We therefore think the most principally moral response is to stop doing all these things and not to do these things again in modern times and think it's making them better. But in case you don't believe me, let me tell you why you are not making them better. They talked about things like lifting tariffs on goods, creating trade deals, and somehow it will help these countries, though I'm not very sure how. So I'll tell you why it doesn't. You think that, how is this going to play out, right? There's a huge incentive by, say, both the UK and its former colonies to do things like, how are the economy favourable to them? In India will therefore have to make use of the UK based on manufacturing, labour-heavy industries, the kind of things they are best able to supply, and the kind of things that UK actually has an interest in getting from them, because UK lacks that kind of industries in its own developed sector and developed country. We also see in African countries, therefore, they will go on mining minerals and selling these minerals only to their colonial masters. It's the easiest way for them to make money right now, to the only primary industries that they have and are still rich in. We think that, no thank you, that is bad for primary industries in colonized countries in the short term. Why do we say this? Sitting on our side, we give colonized countries more choice and more negotiating power as to how they want to use their primary industries to actually gain revenue and develop. No thank you. To put it really simply, what is happening on their side is when Vietnam has to trade its former colonial master France, it can't really say no to France when France wants certain things. This is really important. Why can't Vietnam say no to France or develop any negotiating power? Because Vietnam can't say, I will take all my labour, all my industries and bring to the UK. Why can't I bring to the UK? Because the UK is busy giving favours to all its other colonies. Therefore, you shut all former colonies into trade deals with only the colonial masters, with no hope of seeking somebody else, and therefore gaining negotiating power. But furthermore, right, what else do we talk about with regards to rebuttals? We realize in the long term, right, they also make it worse for colonies. Why? Because we are limiting previously colonized countries from going beyond the primary sector they have right now to the secondary sector. I think it's important, right? Because no one wants to stay in the primary industry forever. They also want to develop their secondary and tertiary economic sectors. Why does that happen? Because now the countries have to reconfigure their industries, their economic landscape around the only colonized countries they can especially make money from. Therefore, this patronage limits them to a specific way of development. Lastly, on the idea of dumping that Enting briefly mentioned, I don't actually understand how dumping is relevant. Number one, I don't see how preferential trade prevents dumping. Secondly, dumping is a form of aid, possibly a negative way of giving aid, and it will still happen regardless of what kind of trade you allow to happen. We therefore don't see its relevance. We hope your next speaker explains. On then to my case proper. What we are trying to tell you, right, is that what we are doing is to perpetuate and continue a new colonial split of the world, where if I was your past colonial master of colonial power, I will help you economically and you're therefore dependent on me. Before I go on, yes.
So in status quo, which is basically what you're defending, your choices of trade are with your regional bloc or tremendously unfavorable conditions with your former colonial power. On our side, you can still trade in your region, so Vietnam can still trade with Malaysia and France.
So yeah, we agree that regional trade is fantastic. I will show you how we do it better on our side in my substantives. But furthermore, right, I just think that, look, as a country with a rich primary market, with cheap labour and manufacturing industries that developed countries don't have, you are at liberty to trade with multiple different developed countries in our paradigm as opposed to just one colonial master, because you can't go away to any other customers, any other developed countries. Moving back to my case proper. Number one, we don't think that they help former colonies. On an economic level, they do not. Why? Because we realize that now, when you develop ex-colonizers, largely form links with the primary markets in the ex-colonies to grow their own, right? It kills off secondary industries in these colonized countries. They won't grow anymore. They will just basically turn to export-heavy economies, full of labor and resources for the exploitation of colonial powers. But also on a political and legal level, you make it very different from ex-colonies to reinvent themselves, right? Because now you are encouraged to keep legal norms, political norms, certain structures, certain forms of political patronage or shifty leaders that were brought in the past, or certain versions of Companies Act to accommodate trade deals with your own colonial power. So if you feel like different laws would be better for your nation and your cultural norms, you can't really do it because it's not in your economic interest anymore. But furthermore, it's not good for all developing countries. And that's my second point. Why is it not good for all developing countries? We realize that you limit free trade, like I mentioned earlier, by creating a coerced choice for countries like Vietnam and so on. But furthermore, in developing countries, there are also non-colonized countries, right? I.e., what are nations like Thailand going to do when there's no nation to give them preferential patronage at all? Also, they limit the power, as I mentioned, I was doing earlier. They mentioned they lessen the power of developing regions to act as a bloc to form regional agreements, right? So we think we're the ones that actually allow regional blocs to come together as opposed to being split up based on who their former colonial masters were. Third point, we realize that the ones that morally validate colonial abuses. Why? Because basically, they're saying, oh, in the past, right, we may have done wrong, but now we're still economic partners, so we're doing good by them. We think it's a huge problem. Furthermore, when you colonize one country in a continent, you have screwed the entire continent out. You divided it out. You encourage ventures into other nations in that entire continent. for instance, in the race for Africa. We therefore think that in doing it, still like favouring certain parts of the continent over others, right? You therefore perpetuate the damage. Last point, how are they the ones that allow for modern day imperialism? And here I respond on China. What is going to happen on their side is that China will say, oh, the Belt and Road Initiative is great. It's what they are doing, I must do it to keep out. And in fact, China will get more aggressive to say things that you guys are being neo-colonial as well. It also validates what, say, Russia is doing, right? In a furthering sphere of influence in Eastern Europe and beyond. You therefore get like powers trying to do this more and more. We therefore think we're the ones that stop any neo-colonial influence and damage to developing countries. I'm extremely proud to oppose.
Thank you to the opposition. Now invite Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for the second topic.
All good, right? Can start? Honourable Speaker, I want to answer 3 questions by way of rebuttal, and then I'll move on to my constructive in today's debate. Number 1, I want to parse through their comparative very carefully and tell you every single scenario results in worse outcomes on their side. In the status quo, the counterfactual isn't that these former colonial partners trade with everyone and are kind-hearted and fair and benevolent towards everyone. In the status quo, without this moral framework of trade that we want, they pick only trade relationships that are economically beneficial to them. And some of these trade relationships actually directly harm their ex-colonies. So for example, when the EU market goes, we're gonna have common agricultural policies. They have no mechanism to make this go away, by the way, Mr. Chair. That harms their ex-colonies in Africa, which is also like an agricultural industry. Our model actually corrects for that, right? Second, these colonial powers, former colonial powers, still trade with their ex-colonies at the moment, or some of them at least, as they accept, right? But in a purely formal economic context, without the explicitly moral reparative framework that we want them to emphasize. That's less accountable, there's less oversight, and a lot of the harms that they want to insist exist also kick in, unless they're arguing that they should stop trading with their ex-colonies, bar none. Why is it that a preferential treatment that actually means, less tariffs or no tariffs for them and special access to markets is worse? That's also unclear. Third, we already exist in a world where China is behaving in a very predatory way economically. It's behaving in the same way these colonial powers behaved before. There are no benevolent actors in this debate, Mr. Chair, obviously, and this is about comparisons, right? But China has not signed on to any responsible lending agreement whatsoever. It is quite an irresponsible lender. It has been forfeiting national territory. It hasn't been engaging in these agreements in accountable ways, and it's been deliberately preying on already heavily indebted countries. It's already happening, right? So if your ex-colonies, if this is the operating environment of your ex-colonies, and you recognize that you do kind of have some moral sins against them, you probably are offering them a better deal when you agree to trade with them preferentially. Yeah.
So will UK be able to continue its investment in Vietnam as it trade in a dozen other colonies first? If not, how is trade with France not a coerced choice for Vietnam?
Yes, it already does that now, right? We agree. This may happen at the expense of countries that were not formally colonized, that's true. But in the status quo, you already make these choices, right? By choosing the countries that are more proximate to you, by choosing the countries that benefit you. In fact, in the status quo, the only standard you use is economic benefit to your country. Our standard is still better. Our standard is still more accountable. There are losers in both worlds, right? But in our world, it is a morally intentional calculus that you are using to determine who wins more. And we think that's better than a purely economic calculus. Again, there are losers in both worlds, right? Now, on the mere presence of our policy, they argue, locks former colonial countries into it. This is unclear. Why? They have a choice. If the terms that you are offering them are not fun, then they will, or are harmful to them, then they'll just go take trade agreements from other countries, right? And this entire part of Enting's speech that they've ignored there's a built-in colonial history here that means that the former colonized country is there are anti-imperialist elements in that society. That's an important part of their political spectrum. These deals are not going to go unchecked. Like, even in Congress, you're going to have nationalist elements going, why are we trading with former colonial powers? Let's make sure we don't have the raw end of the deal here. So like, there's no way to escape that kind of special accountability that exists only as a result of this historical relationship. So you have the ecosystem of checks that doesn't actually exist in other neutral trading agreements. So again, what about other developing countries? We agree, you're making a choice here, the way you already do in the status quo, but the colonial relationship where you directly benefited from extracting from these countries justifies that choice, right? So I want to talk about how trade that is embedded in an explicitly moral framework is actually likely to be held to a greater standard of scrutiny. A good parallel would be when companies or actors say, we are doing this initiative for like social impact reasons and not just business reasons, then that creates a space in the conversation for people to actually say, why are the labor standards so low? Why are the environmental standards so low? Why are the terms of trade really unfair? Like, these arguments become a lot more acceptable and a lot more valid in the conversation when the premise of the conversation is this is being done as reparations, as opposed to we're just trading business as usual. But second, I want to talk about why these preferential trading agreements actually can lead to better political reform in these countries in ways that are not heavy-handed and moralistic. So, and that's why it needs to happen under the auspices of formal state institutions interacting with each other and a preferential trading agreement framework. Why? We would argue that a lot of these former colonial powers, Western nations now, they're not perfect. They elected Trump, Brexit is a mess. But if you look at their deep state and their regulatory institutions, they're actually quite disciplined. They're actually quite accountable. They're actually quite meritocratic and competent, right? They're also accountable to voters back home because they're spending taxpayers' money. There are strong whistleblowing policies in place and a lot of media scrutiny over them, right? So we would rather that they were driving these trade interactions with former colonial powers. I'll give you the example of UK and Pakistan. The UK Department of Trade and DFID have aggressively clamped down on Pakistan, which is a trading partner, precisely because of corruption and poor tax collection services. And they've aggressively said, you need to improve these things. Now the alternative is Pakistan trading with China, or not having the UK as a trading partner. The same goes for the US government and the Philippines, right? Like, despite Trump being president, the State Department in the Philippines and the Trade Ministry that interacts with the Philippines aggressively criticizes the human rights situation, which is not going to happen if their trading partners are China or just ASEAN. So actually, as a matter of fact, this is a way to introduce more accountability in the system. And if just left to mere companies without a clear state framework that we're introducing, companies are going to take the path of least resistance. Some of this can still happen now, but this is a comparative debate, right? And with China, they've already been quite explicit that their foreign policy is quite immoral. So these relationships are more accountable and they encourage more political reform in a less heavy-handed way. Let me argue that there's a moral argument behind this as well, right? Part of the reason that political structures in these countries are so bad is because of colonial policies as well that privilege local elites. So this is a way to right some of those wrongs we're proud to propose.
Thank you, then, Prime Minister, for speech. Continue the case for opposition invite Dr.
One thing that irritates me is you ask Prime Minister every time you run an argument. The reason why that happens is because he doesn't actually understand economics. So you see, when you provide preferential trade agreements to certain countries, the benefits that you gain are not absolute. They are relative to other countries who don't get the same preferential trade agreements, which means that if in the status quo, you've got a 5% tariff on all goods from developing countries, and now Britain decides to give a 2.5% tariff to Malaysia instead, people from Vietnam and Indonesia will still suffer under the 5% tariff. Your goods are less competitive relative to the former colonies of these colonial empires. That means that you screw over other developing countries. That is the reason why we see a huge problem with the system of neocolonialism that they are essentially cultivating. We're going back 200 years to economic empires and structures where you basically have mercantilist like spheres of influence, where Britain has its own sphere of influence, France has its own sphere of influence, the United States, Spain, and so on. That is the policy that they are returning to. That is backward, that is oppressive for everyone. The next thing I want to talk about is the white man's burden, right? Because they come up to us with the classic white man's burden of like, oh no, we screwed over these colonies, let's try to fix things. We're not realizing that it only makes things worse for these colonies, and that we are the anti-colonial side. Because you see, you don't get the basket of like options that we do. When we have like in the status quo, the ability to decide trade deals based on proximity, based on political political affinities, based on economics, we get that. But they don't get that to the same degree on their side because they want to prioritize the relationships between like Commonwealth countries, for example, or France and its former colonies. Because as I said, trade barriers are relative. You reduce your ability to exercise other options when you are under the influences of like your ex-colonial empires. For example, either if let's say for example I am Vietnam, I can probably have preferential trade agreements with France, but with other developed countries who used to have colonial empires like Britain, United States, and Spain, I won't get those same agreements. And conversely, so I can't trade directly with those developed countries to the same degree. And when I want to trade with these countries, I obviously will have to compete with other colonial countries, ex-colonies from other countries like Indonesia and Malaysia as well. That's why we see a problem with that policy. But I'm going to destroy the principle first and foremost, because even if we concede that the practical outcomes that I just elaborated on in the last 2 minutes are all bugger, the colonial responsibility of ex-colonizers extend to all colonies like held by other colonizers as well, not merely the colonies they directly control. Why? 2 reasons. The first of which is what Huiyi said, which went unrebutted. You see, in the scramble for Africa or the partition of the Middle East, we often saw colonial powers scramble to get territory in Africa and the Middle East and in Southeast Asia. And often one of the compromises that they made in order to avoid war between themselves was to arbitrarily divide these countries along arbitrary boundaries, despite the fact that ethnic groups like lived across these boundaries, creating civil wars that destroyed these countries for 100 years hence. That means, in that one stroke, 1 century ago, you have thoroughly screwed over all colonies, not merely yours. That's problem number 1. Problem number 2 was, that's assuming they even stick to these colonial arrangements, but we have a seen history of colonial wars fought between colonizing powers over these colonies again and again and again. So when conscripts from India fighting on behalf of Britain invade other colonies of other countries, like in World War I, in World War II, in the Crimean War, which was fought between Britain and France and Russia in fucking Crimea, God knows why they fought there, or the Boer War, or any other colonial war in the last century and a half, they are screwing over other colonies as well. They are destroying the infrastructure, and they are killing innocent civilians within these other colonies as well. Therefore, given that your responsibility is collective in nature, not only directly to your colonies but to other colonies as well, then perhaps you ought not to erect trade barriers relatively to other colonies as opposed and then preferentially trading with only your own. Secondly, you limit options. The first problem, as I've already explained, is that you have to stick with existing partners among your developed countries. So for Vietnam, for instance, you trade with France, but you can't trade with any other developed country who used to have a colonial empire if you wanted to pivot your economic strategy elsewhere. Secondly, if these former colonies no longer trade extensively with their former colonial masters, to force them, because of economic circumstances, because of differences in trade barrier structures, to trade with their former colonial masters, it creates an enormous structural adjustment in their economies. Many businesses who export to these other countries literally go out of business because all their business contacts and networks were in other countries apart from their colonial masters, and now you're forcing them to pivot for the sake of economic survival to trade primarily with their former colonial masters. That means that a lot of businesses go out of business. That means a lot of developing countries like SMEs are basically going to die out. You are literally destroying the livelihoods of millions of people in the global south. The next thing I want to talk about is that you cannot negotiate free trade agreements as blocks. So if you know that as ASEAN, Indonesia has preferential agreements with the Netherlands, why the fuck I would care? I have no idea. Or the Vietnamese have preferential agreements with the Dutch, but not with anyone else, and the British will have preferential agreements with Malaysia, but they will screw over any other colony in ASEAN. then ASEAN cannot trade as a bloc because each of them were not controlled by the same colonial master, and therefore any preferential agreements they had with one colonial master will be cancelled out by their inability to access the markets of other colonial powers. So you cannot trade as a bloc. You don't have the collective power to enforce better agreements. So even if in the best case scenario, they, because of their apologetic nature, get like their former colonial masters to give preferential terms, these preferential terms will never be as great on the whole as the stuff that you can wrangle out of collective negotiations. You are not strong as a one random colony amongst many. You are strong as a bloc of 500 million or more. This applies to ASEAN, this applies to the South American countries who were not colonized, or by Spain, because there was Portugal and other places as well. So that's the problem that they face on their side of the house. I'm going to deal with the long-term political reform, including like problems about China, but before I move on, I'll take one from any of the three.
Sure. So your solution to the problem that you pointed out, which is that colonizing powers screwed over everybody else, is to allow those colonizing powers to give preferential trade agreements to everyone within the EU, but not anyone outside of it.
So that's not the correct comparative, because as I said, under the alternative in which you actually have regional blocks who had collective trading partners, do you honestly think that EU will not try to strike like preferential trade agreements with other regional blocks like ASEAN? That's fucking nonsense. So that's the first problem. The second thing is that preferential trade agreements with the EU exist in the status quo, like as well as on your side. The only crucial difference is like you will now have preferential trade agreements with one other developing country or several other developing countries, screwing all the rest of them in the process. Your model leads to a far more stratified world. The last thing I want to talk about is about long-term political reform. Firstly, the China question. I get that China is a rather abusive trade partner. I'm not entirely sure that it's a problem-solution match, because you see, the solution to China as a problem is to either bring these complaints to the WTO or to negotiate as a collective body in order to stop China from adopting these practices, or to pass trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership that exclude China. And if the US is not even willing to negotiate, participate in these sorts of trade agreements, what do you think they're going to do with regard to trade agreements with former colonial, their former colonial possessions? Sure, the Philippines may enjoy a temporary advantage, but that's going to explode in the long run now that you realize that all the other colonies are going to be screwed over in the process. For all of those reasons, vote up. We actually understand economics. We actually care about colonies.
Thank you, Diallo. I'd like to invite Governor Wick to speak here.
Now, panel, I don't really know whether I would prefer a world where debates were decided purely on the basis of who's the smartest person in the room, but I know what Adil would prefer on that count. Okay, what do I want to talk about in my speech? First, I want to talk about the moral duty of ex-colonizers, and why we're the only team that answers that. Secondly, I want to talk about why this is better than naked capital. And thirdly, I want to talk about why this is better than China. We won't spend much on that, even though it's something that is largely ignored as a problem in this debate. So the first thing about the moral duty that exists, know that they are silent on this, that they seem to ignore the material that Enting brings you about why there is a reparative duty to these past colonies, that they ignore the centuries of domination and plunder, the disregard for local polity, and they ignore the fact that we have developed and developing countries in the world today is largely a feature of colonization, that at the point of time of the Industrial Revolution, at a point in time that made some militaries more strong than others, they were able to, via violence, create the economic relationships that meant that they developed when others did not. Because, firstly, they were able to plunder resources for their own development, and secondly, with the economies with danger of overheating, they were able to force their colonies to buy their products, often in the barrel of a gun. See the Opium War and other examples. These are reasons why that duty extends to us today, and they don't service it. Because all they are saying is, if we leave the normal economic order to continue on, the WTO rules, Washington Consensus, whatever FTAs we decide that are worth signing, somehow that is an answer to this reparative duty. That all we need to do to pay off this burden we do owe to these ex-colonies is to just let business continue as usual. That's just not good enough. They say, well, it sounds like the white man's burden. I know that sounds bad, but it actually does exist. The reason why the white man's burden didn't exist at the time of Kipling is because these white people hadn't actually yet done anything bad to the black people, but they already decided there was a white man's burden. Now they have, so they do have a burden, and they ought to fulfill that. Okay, the final thing is to say, well, why do we arbitrarily differentiate between non-colonized countries and colonized countries? Sometimes, even if a country wasn't colonized or wasn't colonized directly by you, you harmed them. Firstly, if it's consistent with our principles that colonial countries harmed everyone, then presumably maybe you also have a duty to them and to sign a treaty with them. I don't really know why that's inimical to our case, but even if we accepted that your response of Enting as canonical, there's a colonial power for each colonized power around, so you have someone to answer for, and we think that's sufficient. Note also that these ex-colonial powers are all pretty much equivalent in their economic strength. So I don't think anyone is suffering by having to trade with the UK rather than having to trade with the Netherlands. Okay, why is this good? And that's the bulk of the debate. Know that firstly, the first attack they give is an attack against Western trade and investment writ large, which is also their preferred mechanism. So it's actually quite confusing when Huiyi comes and talks about an over-reliance on primary industry or the over-reliance on Western trade and investment, because that's literally the mechanism they also prefer. But it's a mechanism that's preferable on our side, because we identified two things with the current Washington consensus mode of free trade that doesn't work for ex-colonies or the developing world. The first thing is that when you try to sell overseas to access either just more possible markets or markets that will pay you a higher price for your goods, you can't, because the Western countries have locked their markets behind protective tariffs for large swaths of their sectors. We think that via this moral reparative framework, some of these ex-colonies will be compelled to relax those tariffs, as Enting tells you. That's really important. The second thing they note is that so I don't want to spend too much time, but that is at least one area in which we are advantaged ahead of this current position. Okay, why do we think the alternatives they offer are worse? The first alternative they offer is to say general free trade is good and the ability to trade with everyone is really important. Adil explains this by saying, well, currently if you face an equal tariff of 5% and then suddenly if you drop that tariff by half for one country, then the other countries are worse off. That ignores the fact that in status quo, everyone is equally badly off, which is to say that everyone faces that significantly high tariff when they try to export. But secondly, it rests on the assumption that there is no kind of excess capacity, and firstly, it's entirely possible for that one ex-colonial country to fulfill the entire demand that comes from one colony, which seems false. But secondly, ignores the fact that these other ex-colonial countries get to sell to other markets as well. But lastly, I just think that it's implausible to think that the entire sector of one company could pivot on a change of one tariff in one particular sector. So the point here is there's probably enough to go around, even if in that relative equation, some companies are going to be privileged and make more money in that exchange, other companies will still be able to trade and sell their goods just at reduced rates. The kind of economic gutting they describe simply does not happen because choice continues to exist. Note that on top of that, they ignore the fact that this notion of naked capital and naked free trade is simply false, because the current Washington consensus that exists implies that terms must be symmetric, which is to say, we'll only give free trade to you if you give free trade to us, whereas our process, which privileges the negotiating position of countries in the third world, means that they can negotiate non-symmetric terms that favor them and actually suit the needs of their economies, undercutting and mitigating the current problems with Western-led trade and investment. Finally, they ignore what Sharmila tells you about how institutional standards are far better than capitalist standards, which is to say, a capitalist company trading with operating in a third world country is probably likely to not scrutinize local issues of corruption and bribery, preferring instead to take the road of least resistance, whereas creating a sort of institutional safeguards and networks between State Department officials on both sides is a better way to challenge those structural barriers in the third world. That's why we think those safeguards are far better than the current system of trade regulations that exists. So the final challenge they gave us was that we would form trading blocs, and those trading blocs would try to negotiate trading deals with their ex-colonial masters or with the First World. Firstly, I just don't think there is a political will on the part of the First World to negotiate with with these large trading blocs, but also I just don't see the mutual exclusivity of these things. We often see networks of overlapping FTAs, where you have a trade agreement between two large blocs, but also individual FTAs that deal with individual conditions in smaller sectors, small markets between those things. So we think the model that we are proposing of preferential treatment between colonial powers and ex-colonies can coexist with these larger agreements. I just don't see why that cannot happen. Finally, in China, they largely concede this, I think, recognizing that China is bad and recognizing that the One Belt, One Road model is exploitative. But know that on their side of the house, especially for many of these ex-colonies who have to face the race to the bottom in a pseudo-perfectly competitive international market, their only choice is to turn to China and Chinese investment, which places them more vulnerable relative to China than in a world where they have a reparative actor who can offer them. Very, very proud to propose.
Thank you, Garfield. Invite all to propose the positive case for some position.
We're not going to engage in any dick swinging, so I'm just going to go straight to the details. So firstly, just a couple of things to respond to the Gov Whip speech, right? Because large parts of analysis, if you notice, are largely mitigatory and doesn't actually weigh out the harms and benefits of this debate. Here are the claims coming out from Gov Whip. First one, he claims that the idea of reparative duty is ignored on our side. Is this true? I don't really think so. Huiyi and Adil, poor Huiyi, mentioned that countries today constantly do fight against reparative duties by fighting as a bloc, as a region, which means that it gives you more collective power. This is something that comes out in Adil's speech, which is actually largely ignored. But also, this debate, to some extent, it is true that both sides recognize that countries today do know about the reparative duty, or they do acknowledge the consequences of colonialism. The question is about whether they actually act on those things. It's one thing to know some things, another thing to act on those duties or actually fulfill those burdens. To that end, does their side's policy actually fulfill those burdens? We don't think so. Here's the second response. Huiyi explains that when Prop acts on their policies, i.e. acting on their reparative duties, it specifically exploits colonial countries by one, transforming their primary and secondary industries. Something that we heard no response from. The only the element of response from their side was that no, they would choose other trade partners as well. But this claim can only be believed if you buy their premise that the colonized countries are not making a coerced choice. To that, we say that they are in fact making a coerced choice because they don't actually deal with what happens when the colonized country refuses to trade with your colonial masters. That's again something that Huiyi responds by saying that at the point where you refuse or at the point where you say no, the colonial countries can punish you by not redrawing trade boundaries and to ensure that you don't benefit. So if Vietnam says no to France, Vietnam is going to suffer because France will do everything in its power to squeeze Vietnam out of economic benefits, either through trading with other colonies or not allowing Vietnam to prosper at the end of the day. So don't think this reparative duty, acting on this reparative duty leads to benefits. The second claim that we hear, right, is the response to this moral claim, right? Adil says that it is not just about the direct harms, it's also about the indirect harms in terms of redrawing boundaries. Therefore, other colonies who are indirectly affected also are affected. Their response to this is, if they heard around, perhaps there's a moral premise to trading with countries like Thailand, which weren't colonized as well. This may be true, but on their paradigm, this doesn't actually happen because colonies will have to prefer colonized countries over other countries because there are limited ways of engaging in trade. You only can dictate a few sorts of partners that you want to trade with. And given that they are very willing to aggressively ensure that trade takes place between colonized countries, I'm not sure why colonial countries will suddenly be even more moralistic to expand and also include other countries within their fold, given that this becomes a race towards spheres of influence, which goes back to the 19th century borders, economic borders that were arbitrarily drawn. Anyway, the last claim I want to respond to before I move on to issues is that they tell us that Western markets are locked off on our side of the house. Again, not true. Two things. Number one, Huiyi and Adil told you that we can still trade with primary industries because Huiyi explains that on our sides, incentives still exist with other countries if you want to trade individually. If Vietnam, for example, does not get a good trade deal on our side with another country, what Vietnam can do is to go to ASEAN and say as a bloc, let's try and advocate for a better trade deal because I'm screwed out of this deal and therefore we think we can advocate better trade deals. This balance of negotiation is something that exclusively exists on our side where region blocs can negotiate trades and take counter the huge influence that larger Western powers have. This is something that's not actually present on their side of the house. No, thank you. Two things I want to therefore respond to. Number one, on moralistic reasons, and number two, on the comparative. One, on other moralistic reasons. The claim that they make, right, is that their policy here immediately assumes that there will be autonomy on the side of colonized countries. Because if you notice, all of their benefits of reparative duty can only occur if the autonomy exists. Huiyi explains that this is a coerced choice choice because Vietnam is unable to choose in their instances or even any other colonized country. Why? We say that they won't because by government's own characterization, the developing countries wants the most preferential deal. Saying no also means that the colonizer will continuously deprioritize you on the list of trade partners in this round or the next round or future rounds as well. Thirdly, even if you don't buy these responses, right, we think their policy forces countries to radically restructure their countries economically and restructure their industries. What is this reminiscent of? This reminiscent of colonization, which is exactly what Britain was doing to India in the 19th century, was redrawing its boundaries so that India would turn to an export-based economy. Guess what happens in 2019? The same sort of incentives happens because if as a colonized country, if you don't reconfigure your industries to match the colonizer, you won't get a preferential trade deal, and therefore the trade deal won't be beneficial for you. This can be extremely difficult for countries who are locked into having to be forced to be trade with colonized countries. So countries like Vietnam, for example, will have to deal with France and therefore restructure the economy to prioritize things like agriculture or green energy instead of prioritizing on things like perhaps automobiles or manufacturing, which you are better at. This therefore means that you actually cut the ability of the countries themselves to form their own industries and actually move up the ladder. Huiyi mentions this when she said that not every country wants to be primary industry forever. No response that actually comes out from their side. This therefore proves, I'll take you in a moment, this therefore proves, and this is the kicker, in the long term they can't develop their own industries. Yes?
Sir, this trade block magic pill alternative of yours is very rarely effective, and you need to show that this is really the alternative. There's so much disparities between economies in a trade block, like Singapore and the
But it's not a binary, right? Tariffs are not applied symmetrically, right? Adil explains that different countries trade with each other on different priorities. Their own PM acknowledges this, right? Countries don't just trade for economic reasons, they trade based on proximity, they trade based on ideology as well. I don't understand why in the status quo you can have a variety of different kinds of trade deals that are differently beneficial, because by their own admission, they also explain in DPM, they acknowledge that trades are inherently asymmetrical because every country is selfish. I don't understand why a status quo model does not work. They're simply strawmanning our argument. Why do we win this clash? We win this moralistic crash because their claims of autonomy does not actually exist. You force colonized countries into a false choice, meaning having to pick the colonizer out of all other trade partners, even though other trade partners are valuable. What happens if you say no is that things get worse on your side. Secondly, the final comparative. Their final comparative is that you prioritize ex-colonies versus an economic system. We don't think this is necessarily going to happen because it's unclear why politicians, and this may be responding to their political will argument in DPM, it is unclear why politicians will buy the moralistic premise that reparations is something we should care about. Insofar as politicians are worried about trade viability, and insofar as they care about whether they are getting a good trade deal in return, they are not necessarily going to deal with a colonized country unless it is a really good deal. This premise has to hold true because the motion dictates that you have to aggressively ensure that the other country accepts your deal and accepts your bargaining table. This therefore also implies that Western countries or the colonizer country on their side will have significantly more influence in the bargaining table. So even if you want to talk about political will, the political will is more likely to lean towards economic viability for the colonizer rather than a concern about how good the colonized country is doing. Secondly, if they don't see a benefit on their side of the house, let's assume their best case, right? That politicians really care about the moral aspects of the trade and they don't see a benefit. We don't think the country is going to choose to trade with these individuals anyway. Why is this bad? This is bad because this does not achieve their reparative duty of helping these countries at the end of the day. If Britain if France rejects Vietnam as a trade partner because it's not beneficial enough, all of their benefits of helping Vietnam and the reparative duty falls short. Therefore, their comparative prioritizing ex-colonies is not effective at all because we think modern economic systems are far better suited for trade, and for all those reasons, I'm very, very proud to oppose.
Thank you, opposition whip. Now for all the Huiyi.
So one of the things Jan said, right, was, they ignore the fact that Enting talked for a really long time on the evils of colonialism. No, I put that neocolonialism does not solve the problems of colonial rule. And furthermore, right, what we really want to take away from this, right, is that moral outrage does not equate to good reasoning. Why? Let's talk firstly about what Gov has told you throughout the whole debate. They said colonialism, bad. Developing countries, poor. So we have to help. Okay, imagine I'm saying this like the SpongeBob meme, because that's essentially their case boiled down to basic principles. But look, we agree on all of that. The thing is, how are they helping? How are they doing better by all this developing ex-colonies, right? They tell us two things. Firstly, they said, we are the ones that prevent dumping. After my initial response to it, that was quickly dropped, so I guess it wasn't important to them. Then they said, we create political reform. So that operates on the premise that US and UK are morally better than, say, other trading partners like China, which I think is a pretty colonized mindset on their part. But furthermore, finally, in Yang is like, okay, here's the reason why US and UK are great trading partners, because they have parliamentary safeguards. He says this at 6:23. Thank you very much, Yang. Well, you know what? How is that then different from US and UK trading with many developing countries in status quo? And furthermore, on their side, what happens then if your colonial master is Spain? No one ever told me an answer. But more importantly, I want to look at things that will say on opposition, which I think is really important. Because this debate, right, boils down to the fact that we are operating on the same moral grounds. Colonialism was bad. What are you going to do about it? So I want to divide this in two parts. First thing, the engagement that we provided. Number one, we said, look, you're providing a coerced choice for ex-colonies. Vietnam, for instance, can't take its business anywhere other than France now, because the UK is easy dealing with its preferential trade with maybe like a dozen other colonies out there. We don't really see a comparative or counterfactual from government on this. Secondly, we mentioned, well, you know what's going to happen on your side? You're going to prevent regional blocks. The regional blocks are important because they let all your small, poorer countries have some bargaining power. Enting said regional blocks are bad. Why? I don't know. We told you why. Third thing they say, oh, we concede in response to my POI that non-colonized countries will lose out. But look, you decide an unfair metric anyway. If that's the case, then where is government's moral imperative? Why is that way better than the status quo of deciding on proximity and other factors of self-interest? Furthermore, by the same logic on their side, the colonies that were colonized by less great nations are going to lose out. Also, Vietnam, countries like that are going to lose out. They don't want to trade with their ex-colonial master. So we don't really think they're doing better in a moral or practical sense. Furthermore, finally Yang says, you know what? It doesn't matter, because everyone has their own colonial master, which concedes to my first point about coerced choice, and my last point about how they are conceding what happens to non-colonized developing countries. So thank you for that. Now, let's move on to the last thing I want to talk about, the unengaged positive material that we mentioned. I have 7 reasons. I'm going to list out one by one, so you go back and check whether any of them were engaged with. Number 1, I told you in first speaker that you limit ex-colonies from growing secondary industries in the long term. 2, that it's difficult to do political or legal reinvention that better suits, say, your culture or your norms in your own country. Thirdly, that it validates the shitty leadership that say you're British may have left behind. You can't displace them because they say, oh, now we are bringing economic good to your country, so you continue on these favors, you can't vote us out. Number 4, it validates colonial rule as creating trade partnership. So you're like, oh, maybe the British weren't good, now you can't say that anymore. Because the British will say, we brought trade to your country, so why are you complaining? Number 5, we are saying that your colonial masters will end up screwing up the continent they already ruined previously. Because colonialism, the harms of it, doesn't only stop at the specific African nations you went into, but the fact that you split up the entire continent and made it even worse as a whole. Number 6, we talk about Russia, right? How you validate the modern day imperialism we see coming up with Russia's intrusion into Eastern European countries, trying to accept this Cold War influence. Not that way. Lastly, we mentioned China, the only thing they engage with. But I'll give you a contextual reason why Chinese belligerents will make Chinese neocolonialism worse on their side, which I've never heard a response to. Therefore, I think, just on the sheer volume of valid material standing, we take this debate, I'm actually proud to oppose.
Okay, so I think it's pretty funny that Huiyi was like, moral outrage doesn't make an argument, because if you listen closely to that case, all they really said was like, this is neocolonialism, therefore it is bad. They didn't actually do any weighing of why, if your country benefits and all other ex-colonies benefit, those benefits don't actually add up into something more than the harms faced by the countries right now, or the harms of the countries that they claim are scrutable on their side. I'm going to do a couple of things in this reply speech, and I think that will mostly show that a lot of the criticisms they levy on our case check equally against their case. The first criticism of our case, check against their case, is this idea that there is unequal bargaining power between countries like France and countries like Vietnam. If you look at the policy given in the first opposition speaker, their policies explicitly rely on free trade agreements. Surprisingly enough, unequal bargaining power is still going to exist on their side. On our side, at least we alleviate this unfair bargaining power for some countries, in fact the majority of countries, because the majority of countries were colonized, even if not all. The second thing they say, as a criticism of our case, is that this forces countries into primary industries and never gets them to develop into secondary industries because that's what people want out of trade. Surprise, surprise, if your own policy on opposition relies on FTAs, that same harm is still going to exist on your side. So every single criticism they give about locking countries into primary industries is magnified on their side because they are still locking countries in based on what their trade output is. The third thing they don't solve on their side is this claim that it's unfair for everybody else because Thailand wasn't colonized, so now it's super unfair they're screwed over on our side. Newsflash, guys, sometimes being fair to everyone doesn't lead to the best possible outcome. Right now, every single country is equally screwed over. Sure, it's equal, but I'm not sure it's a better outcome than our side. They need to do better than this. Right, so let's now talk about the actual economics here, which is something that I think they kept shifting away from and didn't really want to engage in. The first thing we told you about is that you have a direct reparative duty to the country you harmed, and our case most gets to that by giving you a direct set of preferential treatments. This is not fulfilled in status quo, which is what they're defending, because all ex-colonial powers countries right now are screwed over by colonial powers. Their criticism of this is that this still happens to some extent on your side, and also you screw over other countries. Note that they never give you a path to victory on their side either. They defend status quo, which means that all of these unequal trading relationships still exist. But second of all, indirect duties. They say now you have a duty to every single other country that you've indirectly screwed over ever. I, again, love to see how they get there, given that it's a principle they want to defend so hard, but never actually explain why they get it on their side. Then they say, you are forced to only trade with colonial powers because France will punish you if you don't agree. 3 responses: prop fiat, our policy, which was never dealt with, I had like 6 years in there, and third of all, internal political checks that mean close scrutiny of that agreement, which both I and Sharmila talk about, again, classic in glory of women. Last of all, they say, this means that you can trade within your trade bloc, and your trade bloc will now trade with every other trade bloc out there. This is bizarre, because they don't actually explain to you why trade bloc agreements happen right now. 85% of trade within ASEAN is within ASEAN, very little of it is outside. Second of all, Jan and Sharmila told you very clearly that all of these things can still exist because bilateral agreements are for single goods and services. Therefore, if the US has a preferential trade agreement with the Philippines, which by the way they do, ASEAN can still trade with the US, which by the way they do. So nothing really changes on our side except for the fact that some countries now get better trade deals. They can still trade with every single other alternative out there. They can still trade within their trade bloc. Their trade bloc can still trade for other things with other trade blocs. Last of all, on this thing about China, look guys, you can't just say neo-colonialism and not realize that China is literally forcing Sri Lanka into debt so they can seize ports. I think that this is something distinct that they do need to deal with on their side. It's something that we at least give countries an alternative to on our side. Very proud to propose.
Okay,